So many people are getting diagnosed with autism nowadays. There must be an epidemic. Yes, it's an autism epidemic. What a load of crap. Hi, I'm Phil, a late diagnosed autistic older adult, and it's my goal to help dispel the myths and speak the truth about autism. In this episode, we're going to debunk the dangerous myth of the so-called autism epidemic. It's a myth that's doing real harm, not just because it spreads misinformation, but because it denies the existence of people like me, autistic adults, autistic elders, people who've lived their whole lives misunderstood, misdiagnosed, or simply missed. Okay, so this podcast is circling back to something we've touched on a few times before. And apologies if you've heard bits of this already, but I really want to focus on it because it really matters. This kind of thing, this so-called autism epidemic narrative, is exactly the kind of thing that holds autistic people down. So what is being claimed in this myth? Who's spreading it and why? Well, right now, the loudest voice behind it is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is the Health and Human Services Secretary in the US. He's made a number of sweeping and dangerous claims, such as autism is increasing in prevalence at an alarming rate. Since 1990, autism rates have increased by 480%. Autism destroys families. Autism is an individual tragedy. He goes even further, saying, most cases are now severe. About 25% of kids diagnosed with autism are non-verbal, non-toilet trained, and have other stereotypical features, head banging, sensory issues, stimming, toe walking. And then there's this one, and I quote, severely affected children will never pay taxes, never hold a job, never play baseball, never write a poem, and never go on a date. Many of them will never use a toilet unassisted. He frames autism as a preventable disease, blames environmental toxins, and claims these children were once fully functional before they regressed into autism around the age of 2. He even accuses people who disagree with him of being in epidemic denial, a classic tactic of discrediting critics by labelling them as delusional or dishonest. But perhaps the most personally offensive claim, the one that really cuts deep for me, is this, and again I quote, have you ever seen anybody our age, I'm 71, with full-blown autism, head-banging, non-verbal, stimming, toe-walking, not toilet-trained? Where are these people? You don't see them walking around the mall. They don't exist. In that one sentence, he wipes me and many others out of existence. And to top it off, he denies that autism is neurodevelopmental altogether, insisting instead that it's caused later by toxins, completely rejecting decades of scientific research just because it doesn't fit his alarmist narrative. This isn't science, this is politics. And it's not about helping people, it's about pushing a dogma. Now, I have to say, I've known about these views for some time, but while researching for this podcast, I finally sat down and read the actual transcript of that press conference. And honestly, I found it physically distressing. Reading those words, knowing they come from someone who holds real power and influence, was gut-wrenching. Watching truth and fact get thrown aside and trampled underfoot by blatant misinformation, well, it's just sickening. To take a group of people, a group who have already spent their lives facing stigma, misunderstanding and exclusion, and then weaponise their existence for political gain, well, that's not just wrong, it's sick, it's deranged. So why are these myths being pushed by people like RFK Jr. at this time, and what are they hoping to gain? He is playing on disaffected people in a way that has been used by many during this current political climate under the Trump presidency. It's about tapping into growing scepticism of science and medicine. Framing autism as preventable and an epidemic isn't just misinformation, it's a deliberate political strategy. He's using it to carve out a policy wedge, to make the current administration stand out from previous administrations. It's the oldest trick in the book, create an enemy to unite your followers against. And tragically, in this case, the enemy he's chosen is a marginalised, misunderstood group of people. People like me, people like many of you, who live with a lifelong disability and already face enough stigma without being dragged into this. And like his patron, Donny T, he's throwing out outrageous statements just to get media attention. Because in their world, shock sells, and truth, well, that's optional. So is it true that more people are getting diagnosed with autism? Yes, absolutely. More people are being diagnosed with autism, but that doesn't mean more people have autism. It just means we're finally recognising what's always been there. There are really good reasons for this. The diagnostic criteria have become more refined over time. Clinicians are getting better at recognising it, and we're finally starting to understand how autism can show up in all kinds of people, not just the old stereotypes. There's also more public awareness now. Parents, teachers, doctors, they're more tuned in. They're more likely to spot the signs, ask the questions, and push for an assessment. And that's a good thing, because early recognition can make a huge difference in how a person understands and supports themselves, and how the world responds to them. So what about adults? Why are so many adults getting diagnosed now? Is this just the latest trend? A way to feel special? Let's be clear, that way of thinking is not only wrong, it's actually pretty offensive. Especially to adults who are just beginning to realise they might be autistic. Or those who have been brave enough to go through the long and difficult process of diagnosis. This is exactly where I found myself over the last 2 years. I hit a point in my life where things simply didn't make sense anymore. The truth is, they hadn't made sense for years. But when I was awakened to the possibility that I might actually be autistic, suddenly everything started to make sense. And I don't just mean a few things. I mean every little detail of my entire life suddenly clicked into place. If at that point someone had brushed me off, called it a fad, a midlife crisis, attention-seeking, or a convenient excuse to opt out of life, it would have been devastating. I could have been turned away from a truth that finally made sense of who I am. And the tragic thing is, that's exactly what does happen to many autistic adults. We make it all the way to middle age, having masked, struggled and survived, only to be gaslit and dismissed at the very point where understanding could begin. Thankfully, I had the support I needed. I had people who believed in me, who listened, who didn't turn away, and because of that, I came through it with enough of myself intact to make it all the way to diagnosis. Okay, so again I ask the question, why are so many adults being diagnosed now, if it's not an epidemic? For the answer to this question, we need to go back in time to when people of our age were children. For me, as a late 50-something-year-old person, that journey takes us right back into the 1970s and my childhood. I was a child who maybe did not look all that different from the other kids around me, but despite this, there were differences. I was shy and I struggled a bit at school, but not too bad. But even back then, I found myself in situations that did not make sense to me. And despite my trying to always do things right, I misjudged other people and what they expected of me. Now remember, this was the 1970s, and the only understanding anyone had about autism was that it was a very severe condition where the young boy could not make friends or communicate effectively with his peers, and probably was non-speaking and with severe intellectual disabilities. Yes, much like that picture that RFK Jr paints. Okay, so I was a young boy, but that was about the only aspect of my situation that could be related to this classical description of autism of the time. And in fact, the term Asperger's syndrome, which described these young boys, but with a normal or above average intelligence, actually was not even coined until 1980. So a description that may have fitted me had not been invented. And let's not forget that these descriptions were only targeted at boys. So any girls who might have been similar would have had even less of a chance of being identified. So the outcome was that up until at least 1980, generations of children missed out on being recognised as being autistic. And as autism is a lifelong condition, yes, that's right, you are born with it and you die with it. This means anyone from my generation or earlier did not have the possibility of gaining a diagnosis of autism. So what happened? Well, as we have said, you don't lose your autism as you grow up. In fact, you just learn to hide it. The obvious outcome is, as we look at it now, we have a couple of generations of autistic people out in the world trying to fit in by masking their autistic traits, but doing so without any diagnosis or understanding why things keep going wrong in their lives. Yep, this is so often what happens to undiagnosed autistic adults. So as the diagnostic process has improved substantially over the last decade in particular, and things like social media has led to more information being available, both men and women are starting to discover the truth about themselves. And this realisation leads to more and more adults being rightfully diagnosed as autistic. And not just autistic, but ADHD and dyslexic and many other neurodivergencies. This is not an epidemic. These people are not catching something like a cold. They are discovering their true identity, and this is a truly wonderful thing, and definitely not something to be diminished or gaslit. So no, definitely not an epidemic, more a chrysalis. And because we were not recognised back then, the numbers of children diagnosed was only a fraction of the real number. So of course, if you compare that number with the diagnosis rates of today, then yes, there will be a huge discrepancy. This is evidence of better understanding, not of epidemic. So earlier we touched on some of the more outrageous things RFK Jr has said about autism. Let's now work through a few of these claims in more detail and debunk them with facts and lived experience. Let's start with one of his go-to lines: "Autism destroys families. It's an individual tragedy." This is a twisting of the truth. Autism doesn't destroy families, stigma does. What makes life difficult for autistic people and their families is misinformation, outdated beliefs, and harmful rhetoric. What families actually need is understanding and support, and in more progressive countries, that's starting to happen. But in places where this autism epidemic narrative is still being pushed, families are left isolated, shamed, and blamed, instead of being empowered. And it's that very stigma that makes life harder for all autistic people, not autism itself. Now here's another quote from RFK Jr. He says, "Severely affected children will never pay taxes, they'll never hold a job, they'll never play baseball, they'll never write a poem, they'll never go out on a date. Many of them will never use the toilet unassisted." Let's take this apart. First, taxes? That's what he's worried about? Not access to education, dignity or inclusion, but whether autistic people are going to pay taxes? That's pretty revealing, isn't it? And as for never play baseball or never write a poem, what utter nonsense. Yes, some autistic people also have co-occurring disabilities like dyspraxia, which can make physical activity harder. But as I've said before, as autistic people, we follow our passions with a level of focus and determination that many can't imagine. I personally followed my passion for sailing all the way to competing at an open world championship. No, I didn't win, not even close, but I was there. And my love of golf led me to the chance to pursue it professionally. I didn't in the end, I chose university and science instead. But that drive, that focus, that came from being autistic. Sure, my challenges also have played a role in the decisions not to take some of these things further. But let's be clear, I was not sitting in a corner rocking and soiling myself, as RFK Jr would have you believe. And the idea that autistic people can't write poetry? Tell that to the thousands of autistic artists, musicians, writers, photographers and creators pouring their entire lives into work that is rich, moving and absolutely breathtaking. And of course, some autistic children will never write a poem or excel at sport. But guess what? Many non-autistic children will also never write a poem or excel at sport. Honestly, we don't have time to debunk all these claims here, and thankfully other fantastic autistic podcasters have already done just that. I'll leave a few links in the description if you want to dive deeper. Okay, let's jump to the statement that personally hits me the hardest, his claim that there are no older autistic people. He says, and I quote, Have you ever seen anybody our age, I'm 71, with full-blown autism, head-banging, non-verbal, non-toilet trained, stimming, toe-walking? These other stereotypical features. Where are these people? Walking around the mall? You can't find them. That one really gets to me, because in saying that, he's flat out denying that I exist. He's denying my life story. I am someone who does stim. I am someone who sometimes toe walks. I hit my head when I'm overwhelmed. I lock toes, as he puts it. But to make sure I'm fully dismissed, he adds the requirement that unless I also can't talk or use the toilet, I don't count. I'm not autistic enough. Let's be really clear here. As we say in almost every podcast, every autistic person is different. Not every trait shows up in every individual. And many of the traits he references are not autism itself, but often linking to co-occurring conditions like intellectual disability. He's deliberately conflating those things to push a harmful narrative. And if I were to give him the benefit of the doubt, I'd say he's ignorant or uninformed. But honestly, I think it's deliberate. Because if I exist, and I do, and if millions of autistic adults like me exist, then his entire message falls apart. One final point here is in relation to 2 sentences where he states, "We know it's environmental exposure. It has to be." This is a clear indicator that he is stating an opinion. It's a space jump between cause and effect that does not wait for the facts. This is not how you do science. The danger here is that you've already decided the outcome, and then it's just a case of finding small, incomplete data chunks to show what you've already decided. Sure, science requires a hypothesis, but then that is either proved or disproved through extensive unbiased experiments. Then it needs to be backed up by independent researchers for collaboration. So why is this epidemic narrative still so prominent? And why are some people and some groups pushing it, even though the science very clearly says otherwise? Unfortunately, it often comes down to this. Some people have something to gain by keeping this toxic narrative alive. In some countries, there are well-funded organisations that deliberately use fear-based messaging to generate publicity and drive donations. And tragically, they aim these messages squarely at parents of autistic children. The narrative goes like this: "Your child has this awful sickness. Autism is a tragedy, but don't worry, we're working on a cure." And that is devastating for several reasons. First, it's just not backed by science. Autism is not a disease. It's not a tragedy. It's a different neurodevelopmental wiring, a brain that has developed a little differently from the so-called norm. And yes, that difference can bring challenges, but let's not pretend those challenges come from autism alone. They often come from trying to exist in a world that simply wasn't designed with autistic needs in mind. But here's the thing. That same difference can also bring incredible strengths if it's recognised, supported and embraced. Unfortunately, that vision of society that embraces neurodiversity, that values difference instead of fearing it, remains far from reality. And it will never be realised as long as fear and misinformation remain the dominant message. Because this fear-based narrative doesn't just limit the autistic child, it deeply affects the parent as well. It leaves them trapped in a cycle of grief and anxiety, with no room for hope or pride in their child's uniqueness. So yes, enough said about those organisations. We don't need fear, we need understanding, we need support, we need truth. As we've already touched on, this situation has only gotten worse thanks to Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s toxic campaign against autism. His narrative frames autistic people as broken, tragic, or even dangerous, and that messaging has been amplified in the US through the Trump administration's politicisation of autism. It's not about support, it's not about truth, it's about control, fear, and scoring points with voters who don't know better. Frankly, these sad little men and their sycophantic followers show no understanding of truth or human dignity. They don't want real answers, they want applause and power, and they'll gaslight an entire community to get it. They're not worth the airtime, and they're certainly not worth the worship they so desperately crave. So enough said about them too. So how can we respond to people who claim there is an autism epidemic? I think the most powerful response to this epidemic narrative is with truth, science and logic. And let's face it, those are some of the very strengths many autistic people bring to the table. But also kindness. As autistic people, we can sometimes come across as blunt. And while directness is not a flaw, it's important to frame truth with compassion. Because some of the loudest voices in this epidemic narrative might be parents of autistic children, or even undiagnosed autistic adults themselves, people who've been misled or scared by years of misinformation. They don't need shame, they need a way back to truth. So when we can, let's gently guide with reason and evidence. And when they resist, because some of them will, we offer what many of us have had to learn the hard way: patience. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about correcting a myth, it's about changing the world for the better. So no, the truth is there is no autism epidemic. What we're seeing is more people getting diagnosed because we finally have a better understanding of what autism actually is. Clinicians are better informed. Adults, especially those of us in middle age and beyond, are finally getting the access to the diagnosis we never had as children. We weren't missed because we weren't autistic. We were missed because the system didn't know how to see us. So if anything, this isn't an epidemic of autism, it's an epidemic of truth, understanding, and long overdue recognition. And maybe that's the best kind of epidemic. That's why it's so important that older autistic adults speak up. We're the ones being erased to make the myth more believable. But we are here. We have always been here, and we're not going anywhere. Okay, that's it for now. Check out the description below for links to other great perspectives debunking the so-called autism epidemic. As always, like, subscribe and share if you value hearing real, lived autistic experience from an older autistic bloke. And hey, add your voice in the comments. Let's keep pushing back together with truth, clarity and solidarity. See you next time. Bye for now.